Robin Cooper is a psychiatrist. She's Associate Director of Psychiatry at UCSF, and she's also been one of Lori and my mentors in the entire time we've been involved in climate change. In keeping with the theme of today, of this morning, Robin has also started an international organization. She started the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, which has been very, very outspoken and very, very involved in mental health issues in climate change in the US and globally. With that, I will turn it over to Robin Cooper.
Can you hear me?
There you go.
Hello, hi. Rob is exaggerating a tiny bit about me. I am co-founder of Climate Psychiatry Alliance with a number of other colleagues nationally, psychiatrists who are concerned about the mental health impacts of climate change. And I am from San Francisco, but I am here adding to my time with you today with my daughter who lives up on the Blackfoot River and gives me the opportunity to come to Montana pretty frequently. And I'm love to do that. So I am going to talk today about the impact of climate change and mental health. And I'm going to do an overview of that. And I'm a little I'm anxious. My knees are shaking following Haley, which was such an incredible and deep conversation about pharmacology. And there are intersections between some of the things that she talked about and the area of mental health and psychiatry and climate change. And maybe we can talk about them. I doubt that I'll take the whole hour, so maybe there'll be some time to talk with you guys. So this is just a way to give the space to make it clear that the impacts of climate change are vast and impact the physical and the mental impacts and community health, and to embed the impacts of the mental health impacts within the broader realm of healthcare. Now, I have to figure out which one to touch. So the mental health impacts of climate change are not just what many people think it is. It is not just about, oh, I feel so bad about the world that we're living in and the changes of the world. That is true in eco-distress, and it's not something to ignore, but it is hardly the realm of mental health and climate change. I'm going to spend more of my time today on the disasters and heat and air pollution, although I will touch on the others. And that we're not going to cover everything today. This is a overview, but the field is quite vast, and that's one thing I want you to know about. It deals with the brain, the mind, and the feelings, and what I then say, what we do with that. So the heart, the head, and the hands. So let's start with disasters. Acute disasters have overarching ways that it impacts both our communities and our mental health. But all disasters are experienced locally. And in Montana, and I'm going to embed some of what I'm saying with examples from Montana so it's real to you. But in Montana, the most significant acute disasters have to do with extreme heat. And I think it's really important to think about heat waves as a kind of disaster, wildfires, and air pollution. And but the impacts of disasters are depending on where you live geographically. So in California, where I'm from, wildfires are a big deal. Although extreme heat, I think, is a disaster that we all experience somewhere. Air pollution also. Flooding, hurricanes, severe storms are, of course, significant, but less so in Montana. And we've been reading about those on the East Coast. So In regards to the behavioral and psychological responses to disasters, they coalesce in these kinds of circles. No one who has experienced a disaster gets away with not some kind of distress reaction. And those can be quite severe, and people can look really, really unglued during periods of distress, such so that they can even look like they're mentally ill. But this is not a moment to do any kind of diagnoses or label people. The distress syndromes are expected, and most people will have them during disasters. So changes in heat, in sleep, irritability, distraction, avoidance, isolation, and a flood of emotional responses. Some of those will contribute then to people managing a lot of distress through health risk behaviors that are difficult. More alcohol use, some drug use, smoking, and a profound sense of separation anxiety. Of those people, some will go on to develop real psychiatric diagnoses with depression, PTSD, and anxiety. And some of those don't show up acutely, be long-term and after a disaster. And of course, those who have pre-existing psychiatric difficulties or mental illnesses are going to be at greatest risk for the emergence of new episodes of psychiatric disorders. But the good news is, see that big purple circle? Resilience is something that many people have. And not everyone comes out of the experience of disasters with ongoing mental health illnesses. Many people recover from those distress reactions. What makes it possible to recover and get back on your feet is a very complicated situation, and many times a component of the social determinants of health. We'll talk a bit more about that. The secondary impacts of disasters, it's not just that what happens at that time with a wildfire or with a flood, et cetera. What happened, these I'm going to go through quickly, but that loss of infrastructure and the breakdown of the health delivery system, hospitals that close. 3 hospitals closed in Manhattan during severe storms. The hospitals completely closed. Those are places that serve large numbers of people. They had to be evacuated. In my area in Sonoma, hospitals closed with evacuations of patients. The health delivery system is impaired. Haley has talked about the interruption in cancer treatment when places that have ongoing chemotherapy are closed. So that breakdown in the health delivery system, loss of services to communities completely, supply chain interruptions, the medication supply availability that is cut off. And Haley and I chatted in the break briefly. In Puerto Rico during the hurricanes, there were no antipsychotic medications available on the island, so that patients who are stabilized and can get through a disaster were then confronted with both the reaction to the disasters, but the unavailability of medications that keeps them functioning. And that can be described over and over again. Loss and interruption of power, and we've heard also how that has an impact on medication stability, but also the kinds of ways, what happens when you're dependent on power. Loss of livelihood, so jobs are lost, and if communities can't recover quickly, there are profound losses to the entire structure of a community. impact on the local economies with businesses closing, and loss of community and connection. People sustain their well-being by being connected in community and with those they care about. And then displacements, migration. There are temporary or permanent, close, where you go to a family several miles away and are able to live through a disaster, or far away or across borders. And you think we're having a problem at our southern border? Migrations are, and pressures for migration to wealthier areas are a major instability for political unrest, as we are seeing now. I'm reading right now a book called The Great Displacement, which is about climate change, migration patterns, and displacements. And it's written by a journalist, and he does an incredibly lovely job about integrating the stories of real people with the impacts of displacement. And we will be in a situation where displacements are going to be more and more a problem as we live in a world with less habitable space. So acute disasters are never just one little disaster. Every disaster begets new disasters, and those can be both near and far. So the middle picture is one with air pollution in Missoula here during the Bitterroot wildfire in 2021. And then the other one on the far side is the picture in New York City in 2023 from the wildfires that were the western coast of Canada. So disasters don't only stay in the one place that people are experiencing them. So I'm going to switch to this other associated component of disasters and talk about air pollution. And air pollution is something that most people know affects your lungs. Kids have asthma. We have the need for more inhalers. But cardiovascular, respiratory, systemic inflammation. But what is much less known is the impact of air pollution on the brain and how we think and behave. And this is a complicated story and much less understood. But before I get into the specific impacts on the brain, I want you to just review the contributions of air pollution. These are what are a part of our lives. We cannot live in our time without the human activity that is contributing to air pollution. And you can see it's quite ubiquitous, from melting permafrost to coal plant to oil production, wildfires, transportation, and I think we have to be very, very agricultural components. Montana is no exception to all of these greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to air pollution, but it cannot be said more, we cannot forget to say over and over, our dependence, our addiction to fossil fuels, and the need to, the drive to be so dependent on fossil fuels is driving air pollution. So when it comes to air pollution, size really matters, and we measure the air pollutants by size. It is not just the particular chemicals that are in that we inhale and breathe. It's not just ozone or nitrous oxide or carbon dioxide or volatile organic compounds. It is the size, and the size is a determinant of where these air pollutant particles travel in the body. And I want to point out to you that These ranges, 2.5, are and lower, the ultrafine particles, which are 100 nanometers in diameter. Those fine particulate particles are really, really tiny. In those ultrafine particles, there are 500 of those in the diameter of one human hair. And the little picture on the top will show you the comparison of PM 2.5 in relation to the size of a red blood cell. These are really, really tiny. And up till now, there have been no regulatory overview of anything smaller than 2.5, PM 2.5. And I don't even know if the standards for exposure to 2.5 are going to be sustained, depending on the vitality that we see in the EPA and the standards that we currently have about exposure to particulate matter. These are really tiny, and because of that size, they enter the body in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to take you through this. But just the process of breathing, what we have to do to live, introduces these small 2.5 or smaller particulate air pollutants into our olfactory apparatus. We breathe these in, and it goes directly to the brain. I do not recommend to patients to stop breathing. It's not a good choice, but just the process of breathing will introduce particulate matter into the brain. Other sources of brain introduction to particulate matter is through the pulmonary system and the cardiovascular system. So we breathe in, goes directly in our brain, but also in our lungs. And then through the circulatory route, those will stimulate an inflammatory reaction, what we call cytokine storm. And those cytokines will have access to the brain also. So there are several ways that those air pollutants have an impact on the brain. In addition, there's a breakdown of what we call the blood-brain barrier, that protective mechanism that keeps toxins out of the brain gets weaker. And so there's an introduction into the brain of some toxic materials that otherwise we would be protected from when that blood-brain barrier is weakened. Then the processes by which the brain is impacted are a complicated way of a combination of inflammatory processes and what we call oxidative stress. And those cause direct damage to the cellular apparatus in the brain. Oxidative stress is an imbalance of unstable molecules, what are called free radicals. And in other terms, I would be supporting free radicals in a lot of ways, but not the free radicals in the brain, which are unstable molecules and not in balance with the normal ways that the brain cleans those through anti-inflammatory processes. I still need to hold this on. I like to talk with my hands, so I don't like this. So air pollution has impacts across the entire developmental spectrum, from prenatal exposure, and there's a lot being done on air pollution exposure to pregnant women and the impacts on fetal development, to infancy, childhood, early adulthood, and late adulthood. Air pollutant has an impact across the entire developmental spectrum. And I'll wait till you take your picture and done. And then has has impacts on real diseases. And this kind of separates the biomedical, the medical physical aspects of air pollutants and the neuropsychiatric disorders. And look how many blue bubbles I have on that neuropsychiatric disorders. Huge impacts from developmental delays to lower IQ to attention deficit, autism, disorders of aging, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this going forward. And on the left side, those things that are of also major concern for healthcare: heart attacks, cancer, asthma, lung disease, and infertility. This is particularly the neurotoxicity of impacts on fetuses and children. The red, and the bottom one, which should be in red, are the structural changes that we see from air pollutants in fetal development and in children. So babies who are born with a smaller head circumference, a distribution of left hemisphere prefrontal white matter that is disrupted, smaller volumes of brain. The bottom one, I have to edit this slide. The neurodegenerative markers of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's diseases that are seen in brains. And I had invited a particular pathologist who works at the University of Montana to join us today. I couldn't track her down, but she's done incredibly important research on autopsy studies of children who have died from other causes in Mexico City, and found that those children who live closer to areas of air pollution, particularly big traffic areas, that they already have markers of Alzheimer's disease in their brains. Children with tau markers of Alzheimer's disease. That just shakes me up. The other things are what we're seeing in the functional areas for children: increases in autism, lower IQ, social processing speed, decreased memory, and therefore academic performance, increased rates of ADHD and behavioral problems. All of these air pollutants exposures are of great significance, but they are clearly greater in areas of poverty and where people live with more chronic exposure to air pollutant. And I sometimes think we are creating an underclass of people that has a biological basis, which is extremely troubling. At the complete other end of the developmental spectrum, elderly have a greater impact, of course, we know, on the degenerative processes of aging. But these are contributed to and added to by air pollution, particularly stroke and dementia. And the studies look at women apparently have a much greater impact of dementia with exposure to air pollution, and a rapidity of those declines cognitively that can happen with the aging process. And Parkinson's disease, I think it's really important that we begin to be attentive to how the greater incidence of Parkinson's disease and may be contributed by air pollution. The Lancet has now said that air pollution is an official factor contributing to dementia and has 2 times the impact of other leading contributors. But more important is that it is in the top 3 modifiable risk factors of dementia. That's good. That's something we can do something about. Wildfires. Wildfires are of course an acute disaster. But in the contribution of air pollution, there are specific things about wildfires that I think we have to pay attention to. Something that distinguishes air pollution from the other forms that we are seeing for air pollution, traffic, industrial production, airline travel. Air pollution is becoming, from wildfires, is becoming much greater concern, and particularly at that intersection of wildland-urban interface. We are living more in areas where there has been more outdoor space, and I worry regularly, because I'm a mom, about my daughter who lives up on the river, and the communities that are growing near wildland areas. And what do we see that happens then in wildfires that happen at that interface? It is a whole nother level of what people are exposed to. Everything that is in your storage space goes up in flames and creates a whole exposure that is not just the biomass. So plastics and other, let me see what that list is that I have here. Water vapor, propane, fuels, your paints, consumer products, the furniture that you have. This is an extraordinarily toxic material. Concern for firefighters, but also for all of those who are exposed during a wildfire in areas where we are living. And I'm particularly from California, so the Los Angeles fires have been kind of rattled all of us, even though I live in Northern California. But those toxic exposures in that Los Angeles fire are something that are really important to pay attention to. This was a wildfire in a dense urban area and exposed huge numbers of people to these air pollutants. And those, what we are finding now is toxic levels of lead and mercury that are in the ash that are left over from those fires. So it's not just the air pollutants at the time of the fire, but the subsequent impacts in the community. So these are some of those contributions of wildfire smoke that are beyond just the other forms of wildfire. And I've kind of gone through these already a bit, but carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides, volatile organic chemicals that are in addition to what we are seeing in other forms of air pollution. And
Thank you.
Said that. Now, the mental health impacts of climate disasters and wildfires, of course, something to pay attention to. Those wide range of distress disorders, anxiety, PTSD, depression, and we see that increase in difficulties in coping. The recent studies have also showed that there are increases in psychiatric medication prescribing following wildfires. So antidepressants, anti-anxiety, and mood stabilizers prescribed at a much higher rate than previously, indicating or kind of giving us evidence of what's kind of obvious. And then increase emergency room visits for anxiety post-wildfires. This, I just want to show that the experience of mental health and well-being effects of wildfire smoke go from what is obvious, from those individual responses to those who have experienced it, to the community responses, to those living and working in the conditions of that, and then to the broader ecological impacts. And so it is quite diverse over such a broad area of concern. Heat plus air pollution is not a good thing. And often our wildfires are occurring during periods of extreme heat, also contributed by drought. And what we know is that heat has an impact, the sunlight has an impact on some of the chemicals that are a part of the air pollution and create the chemical reaction to creating more ozone. And ozone is another significant toxic impact on the brain. So the combination is something that is not such a good thing. I'm going to move to heat waves. I want you to just take a sense of your own gut. What is it like for you when you are experiencing extreme heat? Our colloquial language tells us, he's so hot-headed, he's so hot-tempered, he's so angry, I'm so angry, my blood is boiling. Hot under the collar, or the admonition, hey man, stay cool, be cool. We all experience a lot of irritability and are not the most pleasant during extreme heat. But extreme heat goes much more than just, I feel pretty cranky. Extreme heat has specific impacts on behavior. And the behavior that is of big concern is aggression and interpersonal violence. And these are complicated studies because both aggression and violence and suicide are complicated behaviors. But the studies that have tried to unravel the particular impact on heat itself have indicated that there is increased aggression and increased suicide during extreme heat, such that I'm particularly concerned about the increase on domestic violence and those who have less power. But there is a 4% increase in interpersonal violence during extreme heat. And there is a 14% increase in group violence. This goes from across the spectrum, from violent crime to kids on the playground having scrapes. It's across the spectrum. Suicide increases due to extreme heat at the rate that if we do nothing to control increases in heat, by 2050, the researcher who has done the most significant work on this estimates that there will be increases in suicide that are equivalent to eliminating all of the services that we have on suicide prevention plus gun control. Cognition is impacted by extreme heat. We do not think well when we're very hot. Children do not learn well when it's extremely hot, and this impacts all sorts of decision making and thinking, so that workers who are exposed to extreme heat make poor decisions, and there are increases in accidents at the workplace for outdoor workers and those who are overexposed. There are increases in academic performance. A study that compared Harvard students taking exams, one group that lived in air-conditioned apartments and one that did not, had substantially differences in their performance on exams the next day. Mood, we're much more irritable and there's much more depression. And for psychiatric patients, this can destabilize them and increase their psychiatric symptoms. Sleep and insomnia. Do all of you have air conditioning? Nope, I don't. Do you sleep well on nights when there's extreme heat? Nope. I try to go down and sleep somewhere in the basement where it's cooler. It may be that the disruption of sleep may be a contributor or driver to a number of these components that we're seeing. So what happens when our brain is on fire? The mechanisms of the heat impacts on our brain are the same mechanisms that we see with air pollution. So that breakdown in the blood-brain barrier, a neuroinflammatory response, the changes in cells with oxidative stress, impacting the structures of the internal functioning of cells, neutron membranes that also impair firing and the communication between cells in the brain, and the disruption of that functional interconnectivity. I bring this slide up to indicate one of the, I'm sure most of you know about serotonin. It's such a ubiquitous neurotransmitter, but it's not the only neurotransmitter that is impacted by extreme heat. But this is particularly interesting because I don't want you to know all the details, but to give you a sense of how pervasive serotonin is in the functioning of many of the aspects of our brain's activity and well-being. But also dopamine and norepinephrine are also major contributors that are also dysregulated and don't function well with extreme heat. And dopamine may be one of the contributors to executive decision-making and executive functioning. So this is to give you a sense that there are biological drivers to what is happening in the brain during extreme heat. There are things to do about managing extreme heats. And one of the things that I left out here is my slide about how medications are impacted by extreme heat. And fortunately, Haley covered that. But one of the things that I don't think we can do during extreme heats is alter medications that people absolutely need for their functioning. And so psychiatric medications are one of the big culprits of extreme heat. They make it harder for psychiatric patients to maintain thermoregulation. But it is not a time to stop antipsychotics. So that means we have a big job in teaching our population, our community, and our patients to use behavioral ways to control how to maintain a cooler environment. And this is just one of the infographics. I created this. It's translated into Spanish and Chinese also, that clinicians can use directly with their patients, and it gives clinicians the opportunity to open up the conversation. Most clinicians are busy and don't want to talk about climate change, but you can say, are you prepared for the inevitable heat wave that is likely going to happen? And this is what, here, take this. This happens to be on our EPIC follow-up at the University of California, San Francisco. And there are other ones that are equally good. Heat.gov, assuming that it is still up there, is a great also guideline of what to do. So disasters that are slow moving. In Montana, particularly drought, land and water and forest degradation, loss of habitat and wildlife and fish, air pollution. Montana is listed number 20 in all of the states for drought. And it is more significant farther east here. And I think Rob is much more capable of talking about some of the emotional responses of ranchers who are experiencing the impacts of drought and the inability to sustain their living and the emotional costs. We're also seeing a loss of fish in many of the rivers, and a significant drop, and the impacts of our environment, and of course, air pollution. Now, slow-moving disasters have profound psychological and emotional responses. The experience of living in this with loss of the ability to, with suicide in farmers. There are epidemics of farmers in northern India and in Australia because of their inability to sustain their livelihood. There is displacement and forced migration. So some of those farmers in northern India are moving to the urban centers in India with no urban skills for work, and are adding to urban poverty. But as I said earlier, displacement and forced migration are happening temporarily, permanently, close and far. The threatened livelihood to ranchers or those who make their living off of the land, farmers, loss of recreation and outdoor activities, and of course, that in Montana has an impact on tourism. Food insecurity and malnutrition, and solastalgia. It's a fancy word. Do any of you know what it means? What, you want to say what it means? Anyone want to say what it, go ahead. Right. It is, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but it is that profound grief in the place that used to bring me solace. Again, migration, as I said, is complex, a whole subject to talk about, but really is destructive to a sense of being in place, a kind of confusion and trauma, fragmentation of the community and loss of supports, and that what I think is being unleashed in a horrific way in our own country, the unleashing of a kind of racist hatred when we are frightened that strangers are coming into our community. Now, climate change is a risk multiplier. It is not ubiquitously felt the same way, and I think we've already heard a bit about that. It's going to affect all of us, but those who have resources and wealth and a capacity to respond will do better than those who do not. And that means communities that are impoverished and people of color are much more impacted by climate change. And I bring up this particularly as demonstrative of that in Montana. And I intentionally chose this map, not pictures of the indigenous population, because I think it's important to remember that when indigenous communities their land was taken, they were put on reservations, and the reservation that different tribes were forced to the least productive, worst land, and that many different tribes were brought into a reservation. Tribes that had historically not necessarily gotten along with each other, but for the white settlers, if you were an Indian, you were an Indian, you were an Indian. There was very little differentiation. And we are now paying the price of some of that today. This is a particular demonstration of some of the impacts that the indigenous populations are experiencing, that loss of community, that loss of vitality, the loss of tradition based in attachment to land, as well as, of course, the direct impacts of poverty that are increasing due to climate change. And this is what I think is a lovely kind of, I mean, this speaks to the heart. And it is not done by a tribal person in Montana. It comes from the north. I'm blanking on the name of the Inuit. Thank you, artist, and it describes that sense of I'm homesick at my home, even though I'm still here. And it comes from the terms that are related to solace, comfort, and pain. So what about those other feelings that I said I wasn't going to spend a huge amount of time on? But of course, eco-distress, and that has been in the public media and a big concern. And one of the things that I really want to point out here is there's no doubt there's a huge distress and range of a lot of feelings that are troubling. But this slide also, in that bluish area, talks about some of the other feelings, some of the positive feelings, and that's important, I think, to make recognition of also. For me, that sense of purpose in my life, that sense that I am connected and with others, Rob and Lori, that I can experience a great deal of pride in what I'm doing. Doesn't mean that all of those other kinds of bad feelings are not also a part of my experience. We don't stay in only one. We toggle through many feelings. And this is just one of the slides that I'm sharing with you from one of my mentees who has created this storm of some of the eco-distress. Young people are particularly suffering from the concerns about eco-distress or anxiety. And this study is an international study looking at 10,000 youth in 10 different countries. And it's not surprising, it was not surprising to me that youth are upset and distressed about it. What I think is most striking was about this study, and this is the Hickman study, is that youth were describing the impacts of their feelings impacting their daily function. And that made it more significant. And that they were particularly angry about those in power who had not addressed and are not addressing impacts on what can happen. This study has been is now considered the classic study, but there's been one most recently that has come out this year looking at youth in the United States. It replicates the same thing. The severity is significant, and it is actually across the whole political spectrum. Some of what young people are worried about and concerned about is whether they should have children and bring children into this new developing world where they see kind of a bleakness. And I want to just bring up the Montana, Held versus Montana, just to remind you the voices of young people that are making a difference. And those of you in Montana should be very, very proud that the Supreme Court in Montana has upheld this case. Lori was one of the expert witnesses in speaking about youth impacts, and I particularly chose this slide because Olivia is a student here at the University of Montana, and she's a talented artist to express this through her art, and she's just awesome. Eco-distress is not a pathology. And I always say it is important to recognize that you are supposed to feel bad when there are real threats. You are supposed to feel bad. It is a matter of regulating those feelings, modulating them, using appropriate anxiety to drive action. And that does not dismiss our obligation as clinicians to look for when the distress emerges into something of clinical significance. And then I want to, the climate and health crisis is not an act of God. This is something within our human capacity. And there's much that we can do. And there are roles of all of us health professionals, complicated ones. And this is just one of the models that gives us a way to shape a frame of thinking about how we can respond to the climate mental health challenges. We can work in our clinical way, administratively, how our organizations are structured, the sustainability issues, using our voice for advocacy, research, and I am really one to say, designing research research activities that look at important ways that we can understand, not replicating and filling out your CV, because we know a lot already, and we definitely know a lot to enhance our advocacy and education, teaching those who we have an impact with. And on that, I think we have, I didn't take very much time, did I? Or did I? We have some time to talk. How do I get this off?
Thank you. So of course, on the way here, I was stopped by a coal train that had to divert and go a different way, which is not bad. So the question that led to, you kind of alluded to it in one of your slides, but what about these microplastics? What are they doing to our brain, and where is the clinical evidence now? Where is that leading?
I am not an expert on microplastics. I will refer you to one of my colleagues, Elizabeth Reisner, who is doing an incredible amount of work on microplastics in the brain, but they are having, what I understand, the same impacts. And we have been sold a bill of goods to think that we are actually recycling and able to deal with the volume of plastics that we have. And I'm crazy. I go through my garbage and I sort it, and I think I need a PhD in sorting, but it is a fallacy that we are going to be able to recycle the amount of plastics that we have. They just break down in smaller and smaller ways, and they can have the same access to the brain that I talked about in terms of air pollution. And you've all seen the pictures of islands of plastic. I am also of the opinion that AI, as powerful as it can be and as helpful as it can be, is what is like plastics. I love plastic. How am I going to get my sandwich to be fresh? I can't imagine being in my kitchen without plastic. I think we're going to be in the same situation with AI in the future. AI is a massive use of energy, and I think it will also have profound impacts on how we think and the controls of thinking, but I think we will be so dependent on it in the future that I worry that plastics and microplastics should be our wake-up call. But I'm not the expert here, so you guys, like, speak up about this. You may know more than me.
That was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Given that CO2 is a major driver of respiratory and cardiac activity, is there any indication that just the rise in CO2 from 280 to 440 or wherever we're at changes the body's response to CO2? Just that change in CO2 concentration.
I can't answer that, and I'm not sure that we can extract or separate any one particular pollutant or chemical. We live in a soup pot, and not any one is extractable, but that's the specifics of CO2 alone are beyond my capacity to address. Rob, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, and I haven't seen studies along those lines. I think we focused more on impacts on plants and nutrition, impacts on pollen, a variety of other things versus the direct impacts of the CO2 increase itself.
Right. I do think this afternoon there's going to be a discussion about nutrition and food, and CO2, plants exposed to high levels of CO2 have less nutritional value, but wait till the afternoon for that expert.
Any other questions in the room? I don't see any online.
Come on, you guys. I'm going to ask Rob to comment on what he's been hearing about the emotional world of ranchers who are.
Okay, just to point out, Robin knows because I shared it with her. When Montana was redoing their drought plan over the past couple of years, we got involved to get health included in that. One part of that was a session with ranchers, a Zoom session of stakeholders and ranchers, mostly in the southeast part of the state, at least the one I was involved in. And there were 30 people online. Of those, 5 to 8 of us were people from NRDC and others, people who were working on the plan. The rest were ranchers, men, women. I've been practicing primary care for about 40 years, and much of that was with underserved populations and seen a lot of depression. I have never seen what I saw in that session because I brought up the issue of the mental health was a big issue, and it was like opening the floodgates to the point that I literally did call Robin as a psychiatrist because of these 20 people, at least 3/4 of them were clinically suicidal. This was during the severe drought that we had a couple of years ago. It wasn't just Montana, it was national, but it was so profound. And, particularly from this group of people who are normally very stoic, don't share their emotions, and all of a sudden this floodgates open. But that's kind of the nature of the beast of the mental health disorders and things like drought, because it's not one thing. It's the drought, it's the wildfires, it's the financial issues, and where's the last straw? But that's
Right.
kind of where we're getting to. So,
And
yes, Beth.
Reminded us or taught us, I didn't know this, that when you look at the health impacts of various climate impacts, the one that reached the top was drought. But it's because of this very element, and it's a
Exactly.
longer term impact. It's not you die in the fire or you die in the flooding in the hurricane, but it was this long-term tragic suicidal
Yeah.
dimension.
I was once asked, what did I think was the most significant disaster related to climate? The one that affects you. They're all interconnected. I just want to add another population of great concern are wildland firefighters. And that's really important here in Missoula, which is a training place. And also the Lolo Fire Crew is located here. But wildland firefighters have massive impacts on mental health, depression, and substance abuse. Quiet, those people who are stoic, who aren't going to talk about their feelings, who are going to do just push themselves, but it's also a major mental health issue in the experience of wildland firefighters, and they are massively, massively underpaid.
We
So
have
I
one
won't say-
question from online.
Okay.
Do they use geoengineering to address the drought? Idaho company that makes electricity claims that they are. I read and heard from some farmers it is a concern in the agricultural communities.
I don't know. Anyone? Geoengineering in managing droughts. Go ahead.
I do know a little about the monitoring and drought only because I also go to this school here and I'm currently doing a project on drought in Montana. The monitoring system does include a little geoengineering, but what they're relying on heavily right now is also personal observation. So if you live in a rural area, as I was talking with Rob last night, they do, air quality monitoring is not great in rural areas, but they need air quality monitoring. They do soil, which is like geoengineering for drought. But because the geography of Montana is so different, I mean, even a mile away in what area you are, they also are pulling in, it's called impact reporter. So any farmer, rancher, personal person can go under impact reporter, import their current drought observations, and they pull those together to help, and then they add that to the US Drought Monitor. So the monitoring in Montana is actually really improved since 2018, and they developed a drought management plan, and there's a drought task force that focuses on this, and they have included, and they keep adding to the technologies of it. So yes.
I think that's, thank you very much for being able to add your knowledge. I think it's, again, a challenge for us to think about where are the technological solutions and where are the ways that we really need to consider changes in the way we live and connect and not just rely on the idea that technology is going to get us out of this situation. I also, again, we're in a really, really troubling time, and how much we are going to be able to rely on monitoring systems that are supported by government entities is going to be very complicated. I was so impressed with 37 air quality monitors on the indigenous land that the gentleman before us came up. That's really important, but we're going to have to shift to local and statewide efforts to control those, to develop those.
Okay, unfortunately, we're about out of time. A couple things. One, for the person online and for everybody here, I mean, part of the goal of both Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate and of these conferences is not to just present all the problems, but is to bring people together to start to talk about what we can do. We know there's no pat answers, but as these come up, both over lunch for those here, but also please reach out to us for questions like the geoengineering. We'll try to find out more information, and then we want to share it. And that's the goal of this organization. So thanks to Robin very much.
Thanks for your interest in Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate's annual conference. If you'd like to be kept up to date on monthly actions for climate and health in Montana, you can go to montanahphc.org/newsletters to sign up for our monthly newsletter or click the link in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe.